It seems like folks are still milling around and a few folks are coming in, but I think we can go ahead and get started. I'm also at pains to say that these sessions were booked as interactive sessions, and then I'm promptly up on stage. So please just, we're a small group, and I'm really here in the spirit of soliciting your feedback and partnership. I'll repeat that throughout the presentation. Feel free just to shout if you want to interrupt or raise your hand, and we can try to make this as interactive as is possible with me standing behind this big official patriarchal podium. So hi everybody, my name is Matt Bailey. I'm with IFES, which is the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. IFES is an international NGO. We focus on a wide array of democracy issues and even human rights issues more broadly. But our bread and butter for the last 35 or 40 years is elections. We're kind of born at that moment of the third wave of democracy when there was a lot of really hard technocratic questions about like how do you go from a collapse of a government or from the success of a people's movement to building participatory structures through which people can govern a country. From there, the picture, of course, has only gotten a lot more complicated. And today, our work encompasses all sorts of things, including, as of about 2.5 years ago, when I joined IFES, the internet. So, we've been talking, I think, I couldn't have asked for a better agenda for the day leading up to this conversation, including, my God, taking the stage after Meredith Whittaker. But the issues we are confronting include, of course, disinformation, free expression, internet outages and blockages, internet throttling, all of these issues that come top of mind when you think about democracy and technology. But they're complicated by the fact that elections management bodies, you'll hear me say EMBs throughout the presentation. For my American colleagues in the room, we don't have a national election commission, but this is a national level election commission that has a mandate usually sort of for all elections within a country. EMBs are really poorly equipped, both from a budget standpoint and from an institutional practice standpoint. They really don't know how to contend with this thing called the internet and these issues that come with it in the context of their traditional mission of printing ballots, maintaining a voter roll, voter register, making sure nobody physically picks up a ballot box and runs off with it in the night. These are traditional elections community issues. So we have this kind of terrible, sometimes I talk about it as like the crucible of democracy is happening. All of these freedom and harm issues related to tech all kind of come to a head on election day and in the hands of these beleaguered civil servants around the world who are trying to figure out basically what the hell to do about it all with no resources and very little support. So I'm already moving into this next slide. So we're seeing a lot of different things. One, on that last point, the threats are moving, and they're moving kind of at regional and global scale, the scale of the internet, much faster than democratic systems and specifically electoral systems can keep up with them, or even kind of come to terms with them, even know what they are, have words for them. And then as we start to think about tech companies, and this would include, you could think of anybody. You could think about my colleague from Microsoft is here in the front, and Google and Meta, TikTok, all the companies we've talked about this week so far. But you could also think about Wikipedia. You could think about Signal. You could think about IBM. You could think about telecoms providers. You could think about pager companies. You could think about any company that's operating sort of at global scale. Elections management bodies probably have an interest at one point or another in being in contact with them, and often they need a really close working relationship when there's an emergency the day before the election or on the election or the day after the election. And they really don't know how to do that for the most part. There are some bright spots, but they often don't have the contacts for these companies. And if they do, this is more even common now, they don't really know what to ask for. Like they don't know what the a la carte menu is of things that they should or can be asking for, or what the terminology is that the company speaks internally to itself. Similarly, tech companies, some of the larger American companies I just mentioned, they've been either sort of through their good graces or because of political pressure engaging on these issues for at least 10 years now, and especially since 2016. So they're no fools about this. There's giant, brilliant teams, including Microsoft's Democracy Forward team, a number of different teams across Meta, across Google, and so forth, that are often populated by people who were formerly in human rights work. They're hands-on practitioners and academics and activists who've come inside the company to run these processes. But even so, EMBs are weird. They're not the executive branch. They're not the judiciary. They're not parliament. They're generally, and in the best cases, independent, small independent ministries, agencies, with weird and bespoke mandates, legal or constitutional mandates, and they have to maintain their separation from those other parts of government. So it's like a different dialect is being spoken by these organizations and other parts of government. So that difficulty in knowing kind of like what language do I speak to the tech companies, what's on the a la carte menu, there's a mirror image of that from the tech companies' sides. And you imagine, you know, these big companies that I've just named who've been well engaged for a long time and have a lot of money and have teams. What if you're a small Roblox clone that's just blown up with like 18-year-olds in Nigeria, and it never occurred to you that your technology startup might be relevant to democracy and the future of your country? What if you're a telecom? The telecoms, by the way, have been like weirdly outside the conversation for some reason. And you don't have a team. What you have is like a corporate social responsibility person. You've got some attorneys whose job is to minimize risk for the company. And all of a sudden, you've got a knock on the door from an election commission who speaks this weird subvariant of governance and human rights, democracy and human rights language. So this is a bimodal issue. So we can set aside the question of, are the tech companies doing enough for the moment? We can set aside the question of kind of like, is there goodwill or is there not goodwill? Even when there is, what we see in our work in these 40 or so countries that we're in as IFES is it's just people talking past each other, or worse yet, they can't even figure out who to talk to. So what we decide, well, let me come back to what we're seeing in terms of threats quickly. I do want to give you a QR code. This is like the one and only time as a moderator I'll ask people to open their phones. Please take a picture of this real quick. This is what I'm going to be talking about. So what we decided to do about this is to kind of dive into the problem. So those who are in this space, whether that's more on the activist side or governance side, you know there's no shortage of high-level documents outlining principles and best practices. We've heard about a couple today. My colleague from Transparency International was talking about one related to political finance just a couple of hours ago. They're really important. But what we found is in the already saturated space of how should tech companies work with government or support democracy, there's a blind spot. There was a missing piece, which is this unique problem set that also is incredibly important of how should tech companies work with elections management bodies and support elections more broadly. So what we decided to do was create one. So if you use the QR code, you'll find the website. There you can actually see the text of what we created. So I'm kind of skipping to the end, and I'll come back to it. And the way that we decided to create this was we basically got representatives from the major tech companies, representatives from around the world from civil society, and most importantly, probably senior elections officials, like seasoned folks, in some cases people who've like been one of the 10 people who built their democracy. Here I'm thinking of Irena from Bosnia-Herzegovina, who helped build democracy and the electoral commission in that country after the war. We got these people all in a room together, basically like a lock-in, for a week and developed these principles and then lawyered the hell out of them and then launched them this spring. So I'm going to walk you through the principles, but basically the idea here is we're trying to establish that common language. For tech folks in the room, I almost think about this as like an API that the two groups can use to talk with one another. In order to kind of reduce the friction as companies try to understand what the global community thinks they should be doing, and to kind of consolidate our asks and make them mutually intelligible, and then probably even more importantly, to help elections management bodies know what they should be thinking about and looking for. I am going to show you, I skipped over a couple slides here, why I think this is the right approach. This is not sort of an accountability approach. This is really more of a facilitation approach we're taking. There's a few things that, beyond just the fact that the internet exists, that EMBs are struggling with. And one of them is that you could imagine, if you're a national election commission, you have this mandate as an independent ministry to conduct elections, protect them, shelter them from the political winds that are going to buffet them, protect them from corruption, protect them from foreign interference. What are you structurally going to be really bad at? You're going to be structurally really bad at coordinating internationally. You could sort of think about the headlines, conspiratorial or otherwise, that could come if you have an election commissioner from, I have Vanuatu up here, Vanuatu and a commissioner from Palau hanging out together in a bar, drinking martinis and smoking cigars. The conspiratorial look that could have, right? And yet, we know that things like ransomware are totally global threats, often that have nothing to do with elections, but which elections commissioners should be really, really worried about. Same thing with disinformation very broadly, and same thing with hate speech, sort of the broader authoritarian playbook. We're seeing these as global sort of weather patterns, global patterns of malign innovation, that these isolated ministries, they're isolated within their government, and then they're isolated from each other, generally speaking, as practitioners, are uniquely poorly equipped to handle. I'll also say quickly that I chose Vanuatu as an example because many of the Pacific Island nations are sort of the most extreme example of this. Most EMBs have a tech shop of like 2 people. So you can imagine trying to do anything at national scale with a team of 2 or 5 or 10 people for all of your digital questions, from running the printers, to keeping things patched, to issuing credentials for voting devices and so forth. It's a really, really dire situation. So just to call out these 2 examples that I've included here, so you can kind of hold them in your mind. The one that's on the left is from the Australian Election Commission. They are not struggling like so many election management bodies are. They're very, very well funded and very sophisticated. What I actually wanted to call attention to, I've got a pointer, let me try it. Yes, you can't see it at all. Right here. For those who can't read it, it's an example of disinformation that the AEC is calling out from their last national elections. They're saying, hey, there's a trope going around on the internet that Dominion voting machines are being used to defraud Australian voters. And I was talking with a commissioner from Australia, and he said, this one was an easy one for us to call out because we happen to know there's not a Dominion voting machine on the entire continent of Australia. We checked. We have our ports under control. And his point was they knew this one was coming because they'd seen this disinformation in the US elections, 2016. Their elections, I think it was in 2022. They were ready for copy and paste disinformation campaigns from the US elections to hit their shores. So they were on the lookout for it. They had the copy all pre-written to go up in their public portal, and they went for it. But if you're Palau, you're not ready for that. If you're Vanuatu, you're not ready for that. If you are almost any country in the world, you don't have this sort of capacity, let alone questions of how do you preserve free expression versus combating disinformation, and sort of how do you do that in a rights-respecting way. And then I talked about Vanuatu a little bit. Their entire government and sort of social services infrastructure was crippled by a ransomware attack. These sorts of things are increasingly affecting elections management bodies, just like they are any government ministry, hospitals, schools, and so forth around the world. And most of the commissioners I talk with, staff I talk with, they've all heard of what ransomware is, but they have no clue what to do about it, and more importantly, are receiving very little support in responding rapidly if they have an issue. So these are the sorts of issues I'm talking about. Let me pause. I'm proceeding a little bit circuitously. I'm curious if folks in the audience have reactions or questions so far. This mix of kind of EMBs as the amphibian in the ecosystem, global and regional threats versus the isolation of EMBs, and then how we're going to make change. Please. And if you don't mind, maybe you could stand up and just yell.
very hard to.
Sorry. There we go. Better.
Good old paper ballot is very hard to falsify. So I'm wondering, is like that is a conversation we need to have. The moment you talk about EVMs, you talk about, and there are countries who need to have it. Like I think India, for example, just for the reach. But it's just something I wanted to say that. And we had a digital, fully digital election, which is I think the second biggest after the European election, which is for the German public insurance. That actually worked quite well. Just for the governance part, that was a former member of parliament who was set up as an independent commissioner. So, but the second thing is that, and I'm sure you're aware of that, I was quite surprised a couple of years ago in Estonia, where I think you can vote digitally. You can cast as many votes as you want, and it will always be the last vote that is counted, even till the point that if you decide on election day at 5 minutes to closing, I walk to the office and I put in a paper ballot that will be counted. So I felt that seemed to me like a fairly simple kind of remedy. Would be interested what your reaction is to that.
Yeah, and I'll respond quickly. There's no way you'd have a way of knowing this because I haven't kind of gotten to the principles yet. The voluntary guidelines I'm about to kind of walk through actually explicitly scope out core elections technologies, meaning for those who might be familiar, ballot scanners, apps for online voting, voter registration databases and systems, results management portals. These are kind of something that we're saving space for a follow-on project with. So here we're really talking about all of the rest of it, voter education, an EMB's Facebook page, which is so important in so many countries, your laptops and your core operating systems that you're using for your day-to-day to run your ministry, and so forth. But what I will say is, like, this is actually a really, I was going to call this out on this last slide before diving into the principles. So even these top line issues I've been talking about, like disinformation or the basics of how do you keep your system secure, patching things, strong passwords, these basic issues. The internet's also getting like real weird. And so, I mean, I'm not going to we've had a lot of really, I think, thoughtful and complementary discussions about AI. I'm happy to talk with folks later. I'd actually love to kick around ideas with you all. But like these EMBs, if they're struggling to apply software patches just to keep viruses from blowing onto their systems, many of them, I won't name any names, but I can't tell you how many staff members I've looked over their shoulders and found they're running pirated copies of Windows like on their official laptops, the elections commissions, because they're under such real budgetary constraints, right? And this is around the world. I've been in like 6 countries in the last 2 weeks, and these issues are universal, like on 3 continents. So the example, this handsome gentleman on the left, you can probably tell is AI. This is an example of how weird things are getting and where folks don't really know how to contend with it and what's in bounds for an election administrator. So this is actually a fake political candidate that was run for office and wasn't an official candidate, but there was a big amplification campaign behind him. He had all sorts of talking points, was running against sort of the government. So all this sounds really bad, right? The country was Belarus. And this candidate was created by the Belarusian opposition in exile in order to create space to safely, without sort of putting them, any one individual, or worse yet, their families who are still inside of the country, at risk. And of course, their families are still at risk because they're all under surveillance by the security services. But this, or there's a documentary, you can actually find it on Netflix, about LGBTQ persons in Chechnya, where the producers decided, it's a little bit controversial, but they decided to use what we would sometimes have been referring to as deepfake technology in preference to blurring out the faces of individuals who are testifying about their personal experiences and struggles in order for them to have an expressive presentation, like as you're essentially giving like human rights testimony, but if you're behind a blur, that's very dehumanizing, it's very objectifying. So these are just 2 that are off the top of my head, but there's also a lot of like really playful things, like, and if I was going to commend this Rest of World AI elections tracker page, you can find it on a quick Google or DuckDuckGo search or Bing search. The example that's at the very top of it is apparently there was a movement to create AI fake videos of real political candidates and folks in power just gorging themselves on fruit. Like there's one where some gentleman I don't know is just like eating an entire pumpkin, just shoving it in his face. And it says like, always eat your vegetables every day. But this is apparently saying this person's corrupt. Look at them gorging themselves on this fruit. So the point is, if you're an election commissioner and you're hearing all of this alarmism, sometimes justified, sometimes not, a lot of nuance around deep fakes, AI, is it going to burn democracy to the ground? And then you're seeing some of these things. Imagine being the Election Commission of India with all of the noise built up around this and the environment they're operating in. What do you do? What action do you take? Should you take no action because this really belongs with the digital ministry or belongs with civil society? And so there's a real crisis just sort of in scope as well as capacity that they're confronting. So I could go on and on. Let me dive into the principles themselves. Here's another chance to get the QR code if you guys didn't. This is at electionsandtech.org. Should work well on your phone. Like 2 seconds. I see only my colleague Lisa with her phone up. Oh yeah, you have a question or a comment? Please. Oh, and another one in the back. Great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
My name is Beat Ezedem, Ghana.
Thank you, sir.
Yes. It does appear that conducting elections is becoming more and more complicated.
I'm sorry, more and more what?
More and more complicated.
Yes.
And sophisticated.
Yes.
And so the first question is, how do we appoint the members of the EMB? Mm-hmm. Or how do we select them? Mm-hmm. Should they have a certain qualification? Mm-hmm. Should they have a certain background? Because in the past, when technology was not an issue, it was much easier for people to go along. Today, technology has made things extremely difficult and complicated. And so should we still rely on the same old criteria of looking into somebody's face and saying, well, we appoint you as a commissioner? Looking at somebody's who is a relative and say, we are appointing you as a commissioner, or somebody who has served the party, we appoint you as a commissioner. That is, for me, it's a very dangerous thing to do, because the person goes into that particular position with very little knowledge about technology, and yet he's going to be controlled by technology. So what should we do to ensure that the people who are members of the elections management body are indeed capable of understanding the issues that come up? That is my first thing. The second thing, now, when these people have been appointed or selected from the little narration that you have given, you have got companies that will be responsible for, if you like, doing the rest of the work, printing of ballot, doing this, preparing voters register and whatnot. It's all technology. And they are not themselves savvy. And companies are going to do that. Are those companies not capable of influencing things in favor of one party or the other? And for that matter, is it not possible for other people to go behind the elections management body to influence the companies that are going to be involved in this exercise? How do we control all this? So that is my concern. I'm very much concerned about that. Because we are all talking about integrity, and yet at the end of the day, because of lack of technology, because of lack of an understanding of the issues that are involved, some other people their services are engaged, and they take advantage of your ignorance, and then they do their own thing. Yeah. Today, in my country, we have a challenge, Ghana.
Do you mind if I ask which country?
Ghana.
Oh, in Ghana.
Yeah, we have a Ghana.
Yeah, of course.
Where the elections management body is admitting to everybody that, yes, there are mistakes and that they have vulnerabilities in terms of the technology that they are applying. And so, how can you have confidence in that in such a system? Meanwhile, honestly, the people who are in charge of the elections themselves are not technically equipped. That is the truth. They were just picked from places and then they were put there. And we have to deal with that. So how do we deal with that particular situation? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. These are two incredibly relevant questions. And I won't comment very directly on Ghana, mostly because I think these are global patterns. But I think it's worth recognizing that Ghana is a leader globally, and certainly on the African continent. I mean, resilient democracies currently going through some challenges presently, but who isn't, I say as a US citizen. But a very, very sophisticated democracy, a relatively well-funded election commission, and so forth. Your first question was about sort of qualifications, how are we choosing commissioners? The system is different country to country. Generally, these are either political appointees according to some complex set of rules, usually with some ratio of representation from the parties. More preferably, these are people with credible independence, political independence. So what we see is actually very, very expert people. I think I've accidentally sounded demeaning a bit or dismissive of elections commissions so far. Outside of the realm of technology, these are like some of the smartest and most sophisticated, seasoned professionals you'll ever meet. They just tend to be like constitutional attorneys, constitutional scholars, specialists in the conduction of elections specifically. So they're just specialized in other parts of the job. This part, to your point, is new. Our friends from the Australian Election Commission one day in a meeting said, the problem is that budgets for elections have maintained steady, sometimes not even correcting for inflation, but the internet has existed, so the cost of actually conducting election has gone way up. So the part of the problem is the question of how do we get new generations into these leadership positions at the most senior levels. You need your executives to understand technology at a basic level. The more fundamental issue, as I see it, although I could be wrong, is you need strong independent advice, and then to the point of these guidelines that I'll turn to again in a second, really robust trust relationships with all of the most relevant corporate and non-public, what's the word I'm looking for? Not-for-profit technology players. We really need both of those things, the independent advice that's credible, sophisticated and otherwise, and then strong connections with this tech sector. To your point as well, though, about this question of tech outages, we see this all the time. Nigeria, their most recent election, they had some irregularities with the results management portal, so it was showing provisional results in real time. There were some delays in posting some of the presidential returns. And the question immediately becomes, when we see these things, is there foul play behind the scenes? Because perhaps either there's corruption within the commission, I'm not saying in Nigeria, but in general, or perhaps more likely, the commission just doesn't really understand how its own technology works, in which case there's opportunity for bad actors who are within the tech companies or who are administering the tech, or the tech might just be poorly implemented. And so what looks like a hack, or what the person who loses the election is going to say the election results were hacked because there was a blip in the results, might just be incompetence or underfunding of the technology. The same thing for hacking of Facebook pages, which happens all the time. The Election Commission's page gets hacked. They either don't realize it or can't get it restored quickly, and a bunch of obscenities or politicized content is posted by the persons who gained control of the account, and it's used to discredit the technical prowess of the Election Commission and therefore the credibility of the elections, either ones that have already happened or ones that are coming forward. So this is a huge issue, this issue of kind of creating new technology capacity and funding, frankly, within elections bodies. So I'm just gonna wow you with these cool slides with lots of endorsements of the guidelines, just to give you a sense that it's not just a piece of paper. Lots of cool people here. My favorite, I've been talking about the Australian Election Commission. I love their logo. These are folks who've either just sort of expressed support or have formally endorsed the guidelines. A big thank you to the companies who were involved in helping sort of draft these through this very contentious process that we went through. For those who may not be familiar, the ghost on the bottom right, that's Snapchat. I think we can probably read the others. And we're working right now as IFES to grow this list of companies and especially to diversify it beyond sort of search and social media heavy companies. So really moving into cybersecurity, accessibility tooling providers, telecoms, some of those gaming providers and others that we've been talking about so far. So I'm going to finally turn to the guidelines themselves. There's a few important caveats here. I mentioned earlier this is a crowded space. You can find a whole bunch of other kind of similar looking documents. When we were developing these, the week we were in that kind of lock-in strategy session, that was the same week that the AI Tech Accord was launched at the Munich Security Conference. And you could go down the line. My favorite to always reference is the Santa Clara Principles, now in their second version. There's a lot of these. So what distinguishes this? One, I think of this as both specialized and broad. It's very, very specialized, as I've been talking about, to specifically EMBs as opposed to all government or all democracy. So very narrowly scoped towards that kind of use case, or if you're a design type, it's a human-centered design question. Who's the persona we're designing this for? This is for staffers and commissioners at elections management bodies, and to a lesser extent for civil society who are holding them to account. But broadly, it is differentiated from a lot of these other efforts because it really says basically everything besides core election technologies is in scope. If you are a technology company and you're operating in a democracy somewhere that has an election, we think this is relevant to you. You should look at it. You should talk with civil society. You should talk with the EMB, tailor it, and you should make your commitments as public as possible and operate within this basic framework. And it's concise. So let's dive into it one more time. I'm just going to keep pitching you with this QR code. What we're doing now is, this has been around for about 6 months. We've been working with local partners. I've been particularly talking with COMELEC, which is the election management body in the Philippines, with members of the elections community who are part of SADC, South African Development Community member states, a number of EMBs around the world to talk about what adoption in their countries would look like, which companies we should reach out to. And we are looking for more partners to get involved. So if any of you are working on things that are even tangentially related, if you've heard things here where you're like, oh, that resonates with my work, we want your help. We'd really love your input on it, including what you think we should change. And importantly, so this is the website itself. My colleague Lisa told me I needed to tell everybody what chapeau means. It means intro or frame, it means hat. There's an important line here, which we wrote into it to hold ourselves accountable, which says these guidelines will be updated in 12 to 18 months based off of lessons learned and further input from civil society and other stakeholders. So 2 shortcomings of them that I know now already that we need to address. One, they don't mention inclusion anywhere in there, which is a personal embarrassment for me since this is an issue that I've worked on very closely throughout my career. And 2, similarly, they actually don't mention free expression. So these are 2 big glaring errors or omissions that we'll be including. But I think there are others, and there's probably also nuances within the stuff that is included that needs to be considered. So this is your invitation here. It's a very structural, it's designed to embarrass me in front of my boss and our board if we don't do it. So please help me out, and if you do have thoughts or opinions, including negative ones, come find me. Let's talk about it and see how we can either incorporate our ideas or just get you involved more directly. So I'm just going to run you through these really quick, but please just interrupt me as we go. So the basic structure of this is it's broken into 3 kind of temporal frames. In the elections community, we always talk about the elections life cycle, which basically goes like planning, doing, and then looking back and lessons learned and planning for the next one. It's just like a basic life cycle. So the first one is the most verbose. There's fewer commitments under the other 2. I'm just gonna, you can mostly read these, but I'm gonna spend a little bit of time on this first bucket and then just call out a couple of the others. But please, hands, let me know if you have questions. So the first thing is there are, if you think about, we so often talk about Google, Microsoft, Meta. And while this is actually false, we think of these companies as having effectively infinity money. That's not how companies work. And of course, these companies are responsible to their shareholders. They have various legal obligations under US law in terms of how they're structured, but they have a lot of money. So we tend to get in the habit as civil society of saying, well, you need to do more, and you need to do more everywhere. Fine, we can debate the merits of that. I'm sympathetic to it, broadly speaking. But again, imagine if you're that Roblox clone I'm going to change it from Nigeria to Ghana in honor of our friend in the audience here. Imagine you've created a Roblox clone that also allows gambling and also allows you to do social networking features in it, and it's suddenly big in Ghana, and there's an election coming up, and disinformation is starting to kind of percolate around, or hate speech, religious, ethnic incitement is spreading across this game you've created. You might not have any money. You might have a staff of 2 people, one of whom is 17, and your like rich uncle lent you the money to get the servers up and running. In that case, not only are you not operating globally, even though people may technically be able to download it, but you're going to have to make really hard choices about what limited interventions you might be able to make within your business model. You could extrapolate from that to apps that are a little bit bigger. Maybe they're in their second round of VC funding or whatever, but they're really only relevant within perhaps like East Asia or Southeast Asia. And again, they're going to have to make hard trade-offs. A friend Kip, who actually just left Snap, was saying, look, we're a revenue negative company. We're actually not making any money. We're famous. We had a moment, 15 years ago, but we are not making money, so our ability to do things is limited. And really, we're only big in the US. I think it's the US, India, and Brazil, basically, are their 3 significant user bases. Most countries, we really shouldn't be bothering them about their democracy commitments for the most part. So step 1 is figure out which elections you need to prioritize based off of, we say holistic, but basically saying, where's the risk? Where can you do the most good with your likely limited resources as a tech company? The second one is probably my personal favorite, and it says like, hey, guess what? You should probably talk to civil society before you talk to government. My pithy example here is Russia has an election management body. Belarus, actually, who I already brought up, has an election management body. Tech companies probably should not be in contact with those 2 organizations. They have the trappings of an organization that holds elections, but they do not, in fact, hold elections as we understand them, and they're enormously imbricated with the human rights abuses that are happening under those regimes. But in the world, you can see that this is probably a sliding scale. Many elections management bodies, there's a particular part that's captured politically and is corrupt and is known to be a problem, and there's other parts of the organization that are totally fine. Or there may be certain issues that they're really good on, and others where they have really troubling positions or are coordinating with state intelligence services. So step 1 is figure out what you've got to bring to the table and your theory of the case of what you should do as a company. Step 2 is go talk with civil society, global civil society and local civil society, to calibrate and to proof your approach. I'm going to breeze through the rest of these, but they're basically transparency recommendations. They say, tell people what the plan is, make it easy to find it. A lot of companies are already doing this with election centers or by centralizing their policies or community standards and guidelines or resource hubs. And then the final one that I will highlight here on this slide, number 5, this is kind of a throwback to that point I made early in the presentation about the bureaucratic complexity that's bidirectional between companies and EMBs. Larger companies that are engaged with elections processes, they always have some version of a planning process that's usually tied to their longer-term strategic planning process or their budget forecasting processes, where they look and they say, okay, what are the elections? What elections are on the calendar for next year, or more often for 2 years in the future? And just according to whatever rubric they're using, usually very sophisticated ones, how should we prioritize these? Which ones are the ones that have a combination of real-world risk of harm, potential impact to the company's bottom line, sort of market size in terms of number of people who are using the platforms, either from a business or just from an impact standpoint. They're applying this rubric and they have a list. It's not always public, but it exists. The problem is that timeline, like that planning timeline, is totally disjunct from the planning timeline of the EMBs. So often, and this is not always the case, but often by the time the companies sort of show up offering help, they're either far too early for the EMBs to be ready to receive it, or they're too late for the EMBs to be able to absorb it. Moldova is just about to have elections. You can imagine the geopolitical situation they're in. Both the international community and the technology companies, I think like basically the EMB has like unplugged their phone because they can't get their job done because they're receiving too many last minute offers of help. They're being like DDoSed by goodwill from the international community and from the tech sector, amongst others. So number 5, I think, is actually a really important one, and it's the sort of specialization I'm talking about with these principles, which is like, hey, talk with the EMBs once you get through the civil society gauntlet, figure out what their planning timeline looks like, and figure out what you can do to try to align those two things. They're never going to be perfectly synced up. Businesses run at a different speed and have different needs. But it's basically like an empathy building process between the EMB and the company and its processes. And you can see how helpful this would be as well for like a mid-sized company as they're starting to do these things for the first time. Let me pause here. The rest of them will go a little bit more quickly. Do people have any reflections on any of this or questions? As a facilitator, I'm always supposed to say, what questions do you have, not do you have questions? Yeah, the back. And if you don't mind introducing yourself as well.
I am Bashir Husseini from Ghana. My concern here is basically how to insulate such election management bodies and also IT companies from the issues of being compromised or getting corrupted, especially from the authorities. Because if their integrity is not upheld, especially in the processes of coalition of resource up to the declaration of resource, in which they have a crucial role to play, they could get compromised and subvert the will of the people. So what mechanisms can be put in place to ensure that they don't fall prey to such temptations of being compromised, so that the true will of the people, which is central to any democratic process, is upheld and guaranteed?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. I agree, actually. I think we should keep an eye on this as we continue to sort of evolve the guidelines. It's a big topic, this question of subversion of the tech companies themselves, if I understood you correctly, like influence from within the tech companies of a political nature. There's a couple of examples of this that we worry about, and there's actually good sort of discussion. One is certain countries are requiring local staffing and localization of data within the countries. And there's good versions and bad versions, and there's different ways of talking about this. But skeptics often talk about this as like the hostage-taking model. So the idea is if you have a local staff member and you're therefore concerned about them and you're liable for them at some level, the government can apply direct pressure and intimidation on that individual, on their families, or even on your local offices. So these are in the case of sort of multinational companies. So that's less a question of corruption from within the company and more a question of like political influence on the company that then might rebound on the election commission. But the second issue that I think is not well considered either in the larger discourse or in these principles as written, if we are starting to talk more about Ghanaian companies or West African companies or sort of companies that are acting regionally in a particular space, there you have all these other much more direct issues, like does a political candidate have a cousin who's a CEO and is running one of the companies? Or does a political party or a political candidate, are they willing to dig up some dirt on key staff members within a tech company and get inappropriate information from them? Actually, Meredith Whitaker was talking about a larger scale version of this concern. So I think we do have some issues there. I think one of the simplest ways we always want to address these issues is through transparency, both from the tech companies, what are you doing to help or to pitch in? What is your relationship with the election management body? And then probably even more importantly, transparency requirements and accountability on the EMB. Who are you working with? So these become issues of open tender, open procurement, freedom of information requests, so on and so forth. And these issues are not very well considered for the most part for EMBs today. So thank you for that. I think that is something we can probably include going forward. Okay, I'm going to run you through the rest of these fairly quickly. So we've gotten through sort of the planning bit, and now we're in operations. You can imagine from the EMB side, this is like we are now hiring sometimes tens of thousands of temporary staff, poll workers, and so forth. We are deploying our election technology in our ballot boxes around the country. We are activating our public education campaigns. We are doing social media monitoring, all of these things. Everything is booting up. So what are we saying that tech companies should try to do? One, this is it's not an anti-disinformation recommendation. It's a proactive, positive, or high-quality access to information recommendation. We say companies, this would be relevant certainly to search or to social media companies, perhaps less so to cybersecurity, enable access to authoritative election and voter information. So I think Google and Microsoft are doing a great job of this through their respective search engines. They add side panels or they set special rules for their AI integrations to surface authoritative information. So if you ask Bing, if you ask Google, what date is the election? What ID do I need to bring with me? These companies are putting a lot of work into surfacing 100% accurate information whenever they possibly can. There are mixed results depending on which country you're in, which election you're in. Are these snap elections where there wasn't a lot of speed? Are there authoritative sources in the media or the election commission themselves to get that information? But the companies have good playbooks for this. Smaller companies are absent from the story for the most part. 7 is the disinformation one. It's like have an action plan. What are you going to do to take action specifically on disinformation about the election itself or the integrity of the election process? 8 is, I think of this as the red phone requirement, and there's been good and bad and halting experiments with this for the last decade or so from the larger companies. Basically, the ability for elections commissioners, either directly or via civil society intermediaries, to very quickly get somebody who has the power to pull information down, to regain access to an account, to troubleshoot a technology outage, any of the things you could imagine across the tech sector quickly. The difficulty is that even when companies do this well, the SLA, like the sort of standard response time, often is a week or 3 days or 24 hours. Within a critical election window, EMBs often cannot wait that long. Like they need a response in an hour, 30 minutes, because it's already doing damage to the perceived integrity of the election and potentially damaging democracy in that country over the long term. So establish communication channels. And then 9, and I actually really wanted to call this out. This is my second favorite out of all of them, and then there's just 2 more after this. This one says, publicly provide information on paid political and or paid election content. So this actually directly aligns with the talk we heard from Transparency International earlier about political finance. It's a subset of the problem, but he actually referenced it in his talk as well. Today we have several issues. One is, political advertising has increasingly moved off of billboards, off of the streets and online. So where do you go if you're a party and you want to get people to vote for your candidate? You buy Facebook ads, you buy Google ads. Those are basically the 2 things you do. There's other providers, but that's pretty much it. Those platforms are reasonably good. You can certainly quibble. They do make mistakes, but they're reasonably good about requiring disclosure that you're who you are, and then making sure that the elections commissions, the right authorities get that information. There's usually another reporting path to the election commissions. The problem is we have dark money of various flavors flowing into elections around the world, and campaigns, parties and governments have gotten really good at using proxies to buy paid political content without disclosing it properly. So Facebook, Meta, and Google both provide ads libraries where they try to make, in many countries, not all, they try to basically provide transparency about what they know to be true across their platforms for each country. But we need more of that, and we need more platforms to do this to make sure that we're really tracking it closely. This is important as well as we get into more sort of like grassroots style campaigning that's happening, where it's not actually grassroots activism, it's guerrilla marketing on behalf of political campaigns and political causes. Okay, and then I'm just gonna give you these last two quickly, and then I'd love any last thoughts you all have for the last few minutes. So we've had the election, it's happened. If you're most countries in the world in 2024 or later, you immediately go to the courts because the losing party does not concede. So you're now hanging out with the Supreme Court, trying to figure out who the hell actually won the election and also move forward with establishing a new government. The basic point here is elections commissions and civil society know the election doesn't end the day after election day, and it doesn't end 1 day or 3 weeks later when the official results are announced. It ends sometimes a month, sometimes 3 months later, and sometimes even longer than that. You know, we had our US vice presidential debate last night, and they're still debating who won the last election while campaigning in the current election. So what this means is that we really need the major platforms and companies to not sort of like, to the extent that they're creating a team, a special team, an operations center, special capacity and attention to pay attention to the election through the election, and then they move on to the next one. We really need them to think about a long tail after the election to provide support, even if it's not quite as urgent. This means data, responsiveness to data requests, preserving information so that they can help provide that picture for observation missions, for legal legislative processes that are going on, and for academics who are studying this election academically to develop findings that can help the global community and help inform the next election that happens in that country. And just sharing out what they saw. You know, if you think about some of these companies, and I'd add Amazon, Cloudflare, and a number of other ones to the mix, they really have this bird's eye view of what happened during the election at the digital layer that nobody else can replicate. And so there's just a wealth of information that's really needed there, and it's not just on an emergency basis, it's also on a retrospective basis. So those are the 11 commitments that we have to date. The chapeau, the fancy chapeau I mentioned earlier, says these are live, these are real. So what we're doing today as IFES is we are actively working with tech companies to kind of give them the speech that I just gave you. The 5 that I had up there earlier have been continuing to very, very actively engage with us, talk through it, talk through their processes, what's working, what's not. It's a lot of growing pains. But we're also reaching out really, really actively to a lot of other companies. I'm gonna call out Splunk here, now part of Cisco, because they're ghosting me right now. Basically to build this out and to try to make sure that these are a well understood set of normative practices rather than accountability practices going forward. We're also reaching out to academics and others who, when they look at this, they see a research framework to say, you know, what would it mean to try to talk about the efficacy of these? How does it work and who does it work for? And then, as I've said repeatedly, we're looking for engagement from folks like yourselves. Whatever your work is, you probably have something that you could help feed into it to make these better. As you know, probably sometime next year, putting out version 2 of these with increased attention to things like inclusion and free expression and the thing that's top of mind for you. And we're also looking, last and not least, we're looking at kind of targeted pilots and particularly at-risk elections and democracies that we think may not already be at the top of companies' prioritization lists and may not be already receiving ample support via other avenues from the international community. So kind of targeting like, what would it look like to go really, really big on this in Ghana? What would it look to go really, really big on this on Vanuatu, just to name 2 countries we've been talking about so far today. So that's what we're up to. I'm curious, we have just about, the little clock on my monitor down here says we have 5 more minutes. I'm curious what's going through people's heads. Do you see, yeah, please.
Hi, Rob Ritchie from Fair Vote in the United States. I don't think this would be a fit, but I just wanted to ask, which is that my experience, particularly in the United States, where we have a lot of differently funded election official offices and their website quality, and so the user-friendly nature of how they provide information that I think can undercut confidence, and results pages that are pretty opaque and things like that. So there's tech companies are very good, presumably, at just sort of helping user-friendly kind of experiences, and that would be sort of almost a more pro bono service or something. But is there anything involving tech companies providing their skills to just make the voter, to work with EMBs to make sure they're having a user-friendly experience, throughout, including understanding the results afterwards and so on?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point. I'll say a couple things. One, it's not quite your point, but it's sort of related. I mentioned Cloudflare earlier, and Microsoft and Google both have kind of similar, they're called CDN or proxy services to what Cloudflare provides. These sort of sit between like an EMB's website and the internet and sort of stop the bad stuff. So they're kind of an immediate remedy for things like DDoS attacks. So those are the sort of template I've seen industry sort of proactively engaging on in terms of improving citizen experience of interacting with government websites. It doesn't answer the design and the sort of the content design question at all. But you can imagine step one is like, does the website come up? Can you get access to it? So those types of free services, honestly, I think are potentially transformative, and they're, amongst EMBs in particular, wildly underused. They're also, all three of those companies are very generous giving those services away to civil society. So if you're a beleaguered civil society member who has a website that's constantly getting DDoSed and you're like, your AWS or your Azure bill is randomly spiking, come find me or Ginny, and we can help you get connected with folks who can help just like solve that problem for you for free. The second issue, though, design, this is actually an uncracked nut. What I'll say broadly about the tech companies and my interactions with them, kind of like cybersecurity, the large companies have the best talent in the world. Like they kind of have to for design. What they tend to do, though, very broadly speaking, is they really don't want civil society interacting directly with their product people. So like I'm sure there's others in the room who've been like trying to get to the person who like builds that one part of, well, pick on Facebook because I don't think they're in the room. Like that one pane in the user experience, you're like, God, if we could just fix this, this would be so important. Or if you I was working on a report about gendered harassment online, and we had all these recommendations for Twitter and for Meta and other companies. They're all UX recommendations. It's dramatic. It's like really hard. It's like swimming across a moat that keeps getting wider, trying to get to those product people. And I understand the business incentive there. So what I have not seen is any of the companies like generously, kind of like turning on the design spigot, like design consultations, human-centered design, user research, like these basic practices that any company is good at because they have to be, otherwise they won't make any money. And so I think this is an untapped space where companies could think about sort of CSR, like days of service, that sort of thing. But others may have thoughts on this. The one other thing I'd say quickly is I think that nobody uses government websites. So it may be that there's other things we need to help EMBs with other than making their website prettier. It's like, how do you make your TikTok more accessible? How do you reach people where they actually are? Jenny, please, and the microphone. Not sure where it's landed.
One thing that's not exactly to your question, but is a little bit adjacent, reflects one of the commitments. I'm Ginny from Microsoft, and we've worked together, and just want to thank IFES for their leadership on this. One of the things that we found was when we're trying to surface authoritative information about elections on our sites, there are ways that we can do that, as he pointed out, with like blocks and whatnot. But another thing that is helpful is if the website itself has search engine optimization elements put in, and that is an area where we've been able to identify people within our teams, within the product teams, who can advise the website creators, the actual election authorities, on search engine optimization, particularly around One of the questions we get a lot is there is a disinformation campaign. This goes a little bit to the Australia example. There's a disinformation campaign out there about our state or about our voting process, and we don't know how to counter it. And one of the recommendations broadly is, well, you should have an FAQ on your site, similar to the Australia example, that like sort of debunks some of the theories, because that also helps with search engine optimization when people are searching for that conspiracy theory. We want the source that they get to be the authoritative source, not the conspiracy theory itself, right? So if they include that, so it's tips like that we've been able to offer. It's not gotten to the design level. I like that idea. I'll see what we can do. But there are ways that we can interact, and I know that the other tech companies are open to those kinds of conversations too.
See another hand in the back, or almost at the back, midway.
Thank you for your very informative presentation. My name is Arina. I'm originally from Kazakhstan, but I study at American University in Bulgaria. And I think that most of us seen the CrowdStrike example. And my question would be, in case if the tech company fails during the election process or something goes wrong with its services at the most important time, who will bear the responsibility and what impact it would have on democracy and election process? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful, wonderful question. I assume, is anybody not familiar with the CrowdStrike outage that we just had globally? Okay, I had a fun experience. I was traveling, air traveling that day, so I had a fun experience getting back to my home airport, and all the screens were the blue screen of death. It was pretty good. I mean, the CrowdStrike example, like this is one that people are going to be reading about in history books. Like this is one of the big, probably 2 or 3 solar winds, Heartbleed, fears around Y2K. Like these are all kind of these historic scale global outages. So it's sort of an extreme example, but you could imagine instead of an internet blockage by sort of a hostile government, what if like the telecom just goes down that day? Or what if critical systems fail, like the elections portal that I mentioned in Nigeria that had issues this last election. This is where there's a whole other talk that I like to give about technology contracts and procurements. This is really important for EMBs to be very cognizant that they're writing in that point about accountability and what is the response time into their financial arrangements, their contractual arrangements with tech companies. But too often, something like Facebook, I consider that to be elections critical infrastructure. But there's not a financial arrangement. There's no contract. It's just an EMB creates a page or creates an account and is trying to run it. And so if that page is hacked, that's an outage of critical election infrastructure with no direct lines of accountability unless there's some random law that's on the books in that country. And so the short answer to your question is no one. And so this is kind of where we're starting to try to, like the guidelines here are meant to be a little bit of a foot in the door. We can't solve this. There's no, UN issues a law that somehow has universal applicability to all of the internet. We can't kind of get to that point, nor maybe do we want to. But what we do need to have is a really robust discussion about where do the lines of sort of moral or normative responsibility lie. So I think your question is kind of directly in the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish, or at least get a start on. I think we are just about out of time. Are there any other burning questions? Yeah, just one last one. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Lauren, and thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. So I have a bizarre fascination with election-related violence, and a question that I'm curious about is you were talking about ways in which I think it was like principle number 7 or 6, what was related to hold up. Okay, wait, go back to the first one. I lied. Okay, sorry, number 3. Disseminate clear policies and processes regarding election-related content, activity, civil unrest, and violence. So the thing is that because, and we've been talking about echo bubbles a lot, is that there are legitimate cases of elections being rigged, and for example, like Venezuela, right? And then there are cases like January 6th where political violence is something that is illegitimate. And I just wanted to ask how this defines the quote-unquote clear processes and policies that could be the code of conduct to properly address said election-related violence.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm afraid I'm only going to be able to partially answer your question quickly, but I'm happy to talk more. I think one thing that we sometimes do is we sort of ascribe these like godlike powers, especially to the larger companies. Like I'm not really sure, especially sort of on the day of, that there's a lot that Meta could have done to, like, once people are gathered outside of the U.S. Capitol, to sort of stop the unfolding of events, or certainly they're not the only actors. So the question isn't like what are the magic combination of words that Meta can put into its community standards or Twitter can put into its rules, so on and so forth, that will somehow stop these terrible things from happening. The question is, what will you do preventatively and in response if there are issues, or sort of what's your model as a company for support and for response to these sorts of issues? And the fundamental point here is it needs to be clear, it needs to be public, and therefore at least minimally accountable to civil society and the public, as well as government and political campaigns. So there's a known predetermined set of rules for the road in terms of how the company is going to interact in these very dynamic, fluid situations. So this is basically just a transparency requirement. So it's like, it's not enough to have a plan. You need to tell everybody what the plan is, which inherently opens you up to scrutiny about whether that's enough, whether that's appropriate legally, culturally, which differs country to country, and whether it's a good fit for the specific sort of socio-political environment of this particular election that's coming. I think the last thing that I'll call out here, and this is sort of the most sort of tech company skeptical thing that I'll say, I think that there is fundamentally a mismatch in incentives between democracy community and especially larger global technology players. The large platforms, for business sort of scalability reasons, have a strong interest in uniform and automated approaches to all of the issues we've been talking about, and also more broadly, content moderation in general at scale is a nightmare for a business, right? So this is why you see Meta has, and they say it this way, they're very open about it, they want to have one set of rules for the road globally. You can't go and look and find their localized rules for Sri Lanka, their localized rules for Venezuela, their localized rules for the US. There's one set of global standards. And this is generally true across all companies. The problem is, we know cultures are different, laws are different, patterns of violence and harassment, intimidation are different, expectations around free expression are different. And so it's not how culture works. It's not how the world actually functions to have one set of global standards, other than maybe at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights level. And so part of the nudge here with numbers 2 and 3 in particular is trying to push companies a little bit to say, like, look, you really have an obligation to talk with local players and tailor your approach to local needs and local realities. And then you need to tell people about it so that they can provide feedback on that. The contrast with that is the current state of affairs, where most of the large companies would say, look, we're doing that. And you say, well, you do have a page where you say what your election policies are, but you're skipping the tailoring and the localized feedback, localized input part of the process, or at least it's not highly public. It's not clear how that's happening. So the answer to your question is, it's complicated and it's going to remain complicated, but what we know that we need is this norm of localization and public dialogue and public localized consultation. With that, I'm well over time. Thank you, everybody, for being such active participants in this huge cavern. Look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks, everyone.